The dog wouldn't stop digging. That was the first thing that made Vernon Aldgate uneasy. Not the rusted lock on the cellar door. Not the way the barn smelled like something older than memory. Not even the stack of legal papers sitting on the passenger seat of his truck that told him this land was now, somehow, his. It was the dog. Cody, his 7-year-old Belgian Malinois, who had survived 2 tours in Afghanistan alongside him, and had never once in his life dug at a floor without reason. Vernon watched from the barn doorway, arms crossed, the October wind pressing cold against the back of his neck. "Cody," he said. "Hey." The dog didn't look up. That was when Vernon walked inside. He'd arrived at the property 2 hours earlier, driving 6 hours north from Raleigh, with everything he owned in the bed of a '09 pickup. The farm had belonged to his uncle, Clifford, his mother's brother, a man Vernon had met exactly 4 times in his life, and who had died in August, without telling a single soul he was sick. The lawyer's letter had arrived in September. 312 acres in the hill country of Western Virginia. A farmhouse, 2 outbuildings, a barn, and no explanation. Vernon was 63 years old. Retired Army, 26 years. 2 marriages, both over. 1 daughter in Portland who called on birthdays if she remembered. A rental apartment in Raleigh that smelled like the previous tenant's cigarettes. No matter how many times he painted over the walls. When the letter came, he'd read it twice, set it on the kitchen counter, and then stood there for a long time looking out the window at the parking lot below. He didn't have a reason to go. He didn't have a reason to stay either. So he loaded the truck, put Cody in the passenger seat, and drove north. The farmhouse needed work. The porch boards were soft in 2 places. One of the upstairs windows had cracked straight across, and the kitchen faucet ran brown for 10 minutes before clearing. But it was solid. Vernon had walked through it with the careful eye of a man who'd assessed worse situations in worse places, and he'd decided it was livable. He'd unloaded his bags, found the breaker box, got the heat running. Then Cody had trotted toward the barn, and Vernon had followed. The way you follow a dog when you've learned over years that they usually know something you don't. Now he crouched beside Cody in the back corner of the barn, near a workbench that had been bolted to the wall. So long the wood had grown around the bolt heads. The floor here was wide plank oak, old and dark, and Cody was scratching at the edge of one plank with the focused intensity of a dog who has located something buried. "All right," Vernon said quietly. He pulled out his pocket knife and ran the blade along the edge of the board. It moved, just slightly. A millimeter, maybe less, but it moved. He pressed along the length of it, felt the hollow sound beneath, and then found the notch at one end where a finger could hook underneath. The board came up. Below it was a space about the size of a large shoebox, packed with dry sawdust that someone had put there deliberately, and inside the sawdust was a metal lockbox, olive drab, the kind you could buy at any army surplus store. Vernon set it on the workbench and looked at it for a moment. Cody sat beside him, perfectly still now, watching. There was no lock on the box, just a latch. Vernon opened it. Inside was an envelope, a folded piece of paper, a pocket watch with a cracked face, and a small brass key on a length of cord. He picked up the envelope first. His name was written on it, in handwriting he didn't recognize. Careful, deliberate. The letters slightly uneven the way old men's handwriting gets when the hands aren't entirely steady anymore. He turned it over, sealed. He opened it carefully. The letter was 3 pages, written on yellow legal paper, the ink blue and faded at the edges. "Vernon," it began. "If you're reading this, then I left it too long again. I was always better at waiting than at saying things. Your mother could tell you that. She could tell you a lot of things I never got around to saying myself." He sat down on an overturned crate and read. Clifford had known he was sick since the previous spring. Pancreatic, the kind that doesn't give you much time once it decides to move. He'd made the decision to leave the farm to Vernon, not because Vernon was the obvious choice, but because of something Vernon's mother had told him years ago, when Vernon was still overseas, and his first marriage was coming apart, and nobody knew how any of it was going to land. She'd told Clifford, That boy doesn't know yet what he's made of. But I know he's going to need somewhere to stand when he figures it out. Clifford had held on to that. He'd watched, from a distance, the way people watch things they care about but don't know how to approach. And when the diagnosis came, when he sat in the doctor's office and added up what time he had left, he thought of Vernon. The folded piece of paper was a map, hand-drawn, the farm property laid out in Clifford's careful lines. The map had 3 marks on it: the farmhouse, the barn, and a third spot Vernon didn't recognize, out near the eastern tree line, marked with an X and the word workshop. The brass key, the letter explained, opened a padlock on that workshop. I built it in 1987, Clifford had written. I was going to use it for woodworking, but I never got serious about it. It's been sitting there 30 years. But the tools are good, Vernon. I kept them. There's something in a man doing work with his hands. You'll know what I mean when you see it. He read the letter twice. Then he folded it and put it back in the envelope and set the envelope in his breast pocket, close to his chest, like a man carrying something fragile. Before we go any further, where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments. It means a lot to know who's out there listening to this. He found the workshop the next morning. It was a low timber frame building tucked into the hillside at the edge of the property, half hidden by 20 years of vine growth and the overhang of a large white oak that had been small when the building went up and was enormous now. Vernon had to hack through some of the vines with a folding saw before he could get to the door. And when he got there, the padlock was stiff, but the key worked. Inside it smelled like cedar and machine oil, and something dry and old that wasn't quite dust. There were workbenches along 3 walls, a standing drill press, a bandsaw, a wood lathe, hand tools hanging on pegboard with the outlines still painted behind them, so you could see at a glance what was missing and what was there. Nothing was missing. Every tool was in its place. The outlines and the tools matched exactly, like a man who left for work one morning intending to come back. Vernon stood in the center of the space and turned slowly. He was not a woodworker. He'd never been. But he understood the language of a space that had been cared for. The deliberate arrangement of things, the way every tool was clean, the small oil rag folded square on the edge of the workbench. He'd seen that same quality in the best soldiers he'd ever served with. Not flashiness, just steady, consistent attention. He thought about Clifford, who he'd barely known, taking care of this place for 30 years. Coming out here, oiling the tools, checking the roof, keeping it ready. For what exactly? For a nephew he'd never gotten close to. For a version of himself that never materialized. The thought settled in his chest in a way he didn't entirely have words for. He spent that first week working on the farmhouse, replacing the porch boards, sealing the cracked window, getting the gutters cleared before the fall rains came. He slept well, which surprised him. The rental apartment in Raleigh had given him maybe 5 good hours on a good night. Here, in the old farmhouse bedroom with its bare walls and its window facing east, he slept 8 hours and woke up before the alarm. Cody slept on the rug beside the bed and was already awake when Vernon opened his eyes, watching him the way the dog had always watched him. Patient, present, without any apparent need for anything to be different than it was. He drove into the nearest town, Harlan's Creek, population around 4,000, on Wednesday for supplies. The hardware store was run by a man named Gifford, who was maybe 70, and had the manner of someone who'd been answering questions from strangers his whole life, and didn't mind. "You took the old Aldgate place," Gifford said. "It wasn't a question." "I did," Vernon said. Clifford was a good man, quiet, paid on time. Gifford paused, sliding Vernon's purchases across the counter. "You going to keep it or sell it?" "Keep it," Vernon said. He hadn't planned to say that. He'd told himself he was undecided. But the word came out without hesitation, and once it was out there, he found he didn't want to take it back. The trouble found him about 10 days in, the way trouble usually does. Not with a declaration, but quietly, from a direction he hadn't been watching. A car came up the drive on a Thursday afternoon, a dark blue sedan, moving slowly the way cars do when they're not sure they're in the right place. Vernon was on the porch when it pulled up, and Cody was beside him. Standing rather than sitting, weight forward slightly, the way he stood when something wasn't right. Two men got out. The first was maybe 40 in slacks and a sport coat, carrying a leather portfolio. The second was older, in work clothes, with the look of a man who spent a lot of time outside, but whose hands didn't carry the calluses of someone who worked with them. The man in the sport coat introduced himself as Leonard Fitch, an attorney. He represented a development company called Cascade Holdings. They were, he explained pleasantly, very interested in the Aldgate property. More specifically, they were prepared to make a generous offer. Vernon listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When Fitch finished, Vernon asked how they'd known so quickly that the property had changed hands. Fitch smiled, the kind of smile that's been practiced in mirrors. We keep track of estate transfers in the region. It's simply due diligence. The property isn't for sale, Vernon said. Fitch's smile didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. I understand. Of course there's no pressure. We'd simply ask you to review. It isn't for sale, Vernon said again. They left. He didn't think about it much that evening. He'd dealt with pressure, real pressure, the kind that could kill you, and two men in a sedan didn't register on that scale. He made dinner, sat on the porch, watched Cody work the edge of the yard in the evening dark, that low trotting patrol the dog had done his whole life like it was hardwired in. But things changed after that, slowly at first. The county assessor's office notified him, 3 weeks in, that there was an existing lien on the property from an unpaid contractor claim dating back 11 years. It was not a large amount, but it was enough to complicate a clear title. Vernon drove to the county courthouse and spent 2 hours going through records. The contractor in question had gone out of business in 2019. The claim had been disputed at the time and never resolved. He hired a local attorney, a woman named Teresa Mack, who had a small office on Harlan's Creek's Main Street, and who looked at the paperwork Vernon spread across her desk with the expression of someone who has seen this movie before. This is not an accident, she said. No, Vernon said. I didn't think it was. She explained it carefully. Cascade Holdings, or an entity connected to them, had been accumulating land in this county for the past 4 years. They'd used various strategies to pressure property owners. Old lien surfaced, zoning complaints filed, access roads suddenly disputed. Nothing obviously illegal. Everything just difficult enough that people got tired and sold. Clifford wouldn't sell, Teresa said. He never mentioned this to me, Vernon said. He might not have known how far along it had gotten. Or, she paused, he might have wanted to leave you a clean fight. Some people think that way. He drove home that evening and sat in the workshop with the lights on, Cody lying at his feet. He thought about Clifford's letter, about his mother's words relayed through a dying man's handwriting. He's going to need somewhere to stand when he figures it out. He thought he was beginning to understand what that meant. The situation moved faster after that. A formal letter arrived from a law firm in Richmond, claiming that the original deed transfer, Clifford's will, contained irregularities relating to a prior verbal agreement Clifford had allegedly made with a neighboring landowner. The claim was thin, and Teresa called it exactly that. But it cost time. It cost money, and it was clearly designed to do both. Then, on a cold Tuesday in November, while Vernon was working in the barn with Cody loose in the yard, he heard the dog make a sound he hadn't heard in years. A short, sharp cry, cut off almost immediately. He dropped the wrench he was holding and was out the barn door in 2 seconds. Cody was on the ground near the fence line, 20 yards from the barn. Vernon ran to him. The dog was breathing, fast, shallow, the wrong kind of shallow, and there was blood along his left side. Vernon looked up, and the back gate was hanging open, and there was a car on the road at the bottom of the property, already moving, already too far to read the plates. He didn't think. He scooped Cody up, 70 pounds of dog, but it didn't feel like anything, and put him on the back seat of the truck and drove. The nearest veterinary emergency clinic was 22 miles. Vernon drove those 22 miles in 16 minutes. He talked to Cody the whole way, not words exactly, just sound. The low, steady tone he'd used in situations where noise was dangerous, and presence was the only thing you could offer. Cody's eyes stayed open. That was what Vernon focused on, just keeping that going, just the eyes staying open. He carried the dog inside. The vet on duty was a young woman named Dr. Abernath who took one look at them both and didn't ask any unnecessary questions. She took Cody from Vernon's arms and told him to wait. Vernon sat in the waiting room for 3 hours. There was a television on the wall, playing a cable news channel with the sound off. There were 2 other people in the room, a man with a cat carrier and an older woman with a small dog in her lap. Vernon sat with his hands on his knees, still wearing his work jacket, blood on the sleeve. He did not watch the television. He looked at the floor, and he thought about every decision that had led him to this moment, all the way back to the letter on the counter in Raleigh. And he decided that none of them were ones he would undo. If that was what the math added up to, that choosing to stay meant this, then he would stay and deal with what came with it. Dr. Abernath came out at 10:30. "He's stable," she said. "It was a puncture wound, something narrow, deliberate. He's lucky it missed anything critical by about 3 centimeters. We've got him on fluids and antibiotics. He'll need to stay overnight, probably 2 nights. Vernon exhaled slowly. "Can I see him?" "For a few minutes." Cody was in a small kennel, lying on his side, an IV line running to his foreleg. He looked up when Vernon crouched beside him, and his tail moved once, not a wag, just a small acknowledgement. "I see you. I'm here." "I know," Vernon said. "Me too." He drove back to the farm at midnight. The house was dark and quiet, and felt different without the dog in it. Hollower. Like a room where something important had been removed. He sat at the kitchen table and called Teresa Mack's number, and left a message describing what had happened and asking her to call him in the morning. Then he called the county sheriff's office and filed a report. The deputy who took the report was a man named Gareth Lowe, early 30s, who wrote everything down carefully and said he would follow up. He asked the right questions. He didn't seem inclined to dismiss what he was hearing. Vernon had dealt with enough officials in his life to know the difference between someone going through the motions and someone who was actually listening, and Deputy Lowe was listening. "This property," Lowe said at the end, not looking up from his notepad. "Has anyone approached you about selling it?" "Yes," Vernon said. Lowe nodded slowly, wrote something else down and said he'd be in touch. He picked Cody up 2 days later. The dog was moving stiffly but moving, which was the thing that mattered. Vernon brought him inside the farmhouse and set up a bed for him in the kitchen and stayed close for the rest of the week, working on things that kept him nearby, sharpening tools in the workshop, splitting firewood just outside the kitchen window where he could check through the glass. Teresa called on Thursday. The lien issue had been resolved. The contractor's defunct business had no surviving legal representation, and the claim had been formally dismissed. The deed challenge from the Richmond firm was still pending, but Teresa had found something in the county records. The same law firm had represented Cascade Holdings in 3 prior property disputes in neighboring counties, all of which had been settled quietly out of court. It established a pattern, and it gave them something to work with. "We can push back," Teresa said. "Hard do it," Vernon said. What he hadn't expected in the middle of all of it was the town. Harlan's Creek was small enough that word traveled fast and large enough that people still surprised you. Gifford at the hardware store had apparently mentioned to someone that the man who'd taken the Aldgate place was having a hard time of it. And within a week, Vernon had received 3 phone calls, 2 casseroles left on the porch, and an offer from a retired surveyor named Al Hempstead to walk the property line with him and document any encroachment, which they did on a Saturday morning in late November, walking the fence in the cold with a GPS unit and a thermos of coffee, Cody moving slowly but steadily beside them. Clifford had the same trouble about 6 years back, Al said. stepping carefully over a downed branch. Different company? Same strategy? He held on. Why didn't anyone tell me this when I arrived? Vernon asked. Al looked at him. Because we didn't know if you were going to stay. That was fair. Vernon thought about how he'd answered Gifford. That first day at the hardware store, the word keep coming out before he'd decided it. Maybe some part of him had known before he knew. The legal challenge collapsed in late January. Teresa called him on a Tuesday morning, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction she was mostly keeping professional. The law firm in Richmond had withdrawn the deed challenge. Cascade Holdings had simultaneously, and apparently quietly, shifted their acquisition focus to a different county. Deputy Lowe, now acting in a more official investigative capacity, had apparently had a number of conversations with certain individuals that had made the cost-benefit calculation less favorable. That's it? Vernon asked. That's it, Teresa said. For now, these things can come back, but you're clear. He walked out to the porch after he hung up. It was a cold morning, the hills still brown, and waiting for whatever came next. The kind of day that doesn't promise anything, but doesn't take anything away either. Cody came and sat beside him. The dog's side had healed cleanly. There was a small scar there that the fur would cover by spring, and he moved without stiffness now. That same low, easy trot he'd always had. Vernon thought about Clifford's letter, about the pocket watch with the cracked face, about the tools hanging in their outlines in the workshop, waiting 30 years for someone to use them. He thought about all the men he'd served with, some of them lost, some of them found, most of them somewhere in between, carrying weight that the civilian world didn't have good vocabulary for. He thought about what the workshop could be. Not a personal project. Something else. He went inside and made a call to the Veterans Services office in Roanoke. It took 4 months. There was paperwork, and there were inspections, and there was a grant application that took 3 drafts and the help of a retired social worker named Pauline, who'd been recommended by Teresa, and who turned out to be exactly the kind of person you want in your corner when you're building something from nothing. There was a long Saturday in March, when Vernon and Al Hempstead, and 2 other men from town, rebuilt the workshop's electrical panel. There was a weekend in April when Cody supervised the installation of a second workbench from a vantage point on an old blanket in the corner, occasionally thumping his tail when something clanged loudly enough to require acknowledgement. The workshop opened in May, not with any ceremony Vernon had planned. He'd specifically avoided planning ceremony, because he'd found in his experience that ceremony was usually for the people who didn't need it. Instead, it opened on a Tuesday morning, when a man named Curtis showed up. Curtis was 58, a Gulf War veteran, recently out of a transitional housing program in Roanoke, referred by the VA. He drove an old Civic, and he shook Vernon's hand and looked around the workshop with the careful eyes of someone who has learned to assess spaces for safety before anything else. I used to do woodworking, Curtis said. Before, tools are good, Vernon said. I'll leave you to it. He went back to the farmhouse and left the workshop door open. An hour later, he looked out the window and could see the light on inside, and hear faintly the sound of the bandsaw. By September, there were 7 regulars. They came on different days for different hours, some of them talking and some of them not. Some of them producing things, cutting boards, a cedar box, a set of small shelves, and some of them just working, which is its own kind of producing. Vernon made coffee in the farmhouse kitchen at 6 every morning and kept a pot going. There was no program, no intake form beyond what the VA required, just the tools and the wood and the time and whoever showed up. Cody moved among them with the ease of a dog who had spent his whole life around men in various states of difficulty and had long ago stopped needing those states to be explained to him. He would settle beside whoever seemed to need it most that day, without any apparent calculation, just presence. Vernon had watched him do it in worse places than a Virginia workshop, and it still got to him sometimes. The dog's simple, total accuracy about where to be. One afternoon in October, Almost exactly a year after he'd arrived, Vernon was sitting on the porch in the late light when he heard his daughter's voice in his head, asking a question she had actually asked, back in September, when she'd called. She'd asked him how it had happened. How he'd gone from a cigarette-smelling apartment in Raleigh to this. How this had become his life. He'd thought about it before answering. He wasn't sure she'd understand the answer he actually had, which was that it hadn't happened all at once, but in small decisions, each one barely visible, each one only obviously right in retrospect. The word keep in a hardware store. Driving 22 miles in 16 minutes. A letter read on an overturned crate in a barn that smelled like something older than memory. What he'd said to her was simpler. There was a dog that knew something I didn't. I followed him. She'd been quiet for a moment. Then she'd said she thought she might come visit in the spring. He'd said that would be good. That evening he walked the property with Cody in the last of the October light. The same hills and fence lines and tree edges he'd been walking for a year. And they stopped, as they often did, near the workshop with its windows lit from inside. Curtis was in there, finishing the set of shelves he'd been working on for 3 weeks. The sound of sandpaper moving over wood came through the walls, slow and steady. The sound of someone paying attention to something. Cody sat beside him and leaned slightly against his leg. The mountains stood around the valley in the early dark, holding everything in, the way certain things hold without ever making a sound about it. Vernon put his hand on the dog's head. Some things don't need more than that.